show you how to create a slotted seam. That's right, you're gonna learn a new sewing technique today. You can put a slotted seam anywhere you have a plain seam on a project. So this is a great way to elevate your projects, give them a higher end look, add more detail to them, and it's super simple. So follow along and I'm gonna show you how to create a slotted seam. And I want you to try and say that 10 times fast. Slotted seam, slotted seam, slotted. Whoa, it's a mess. I'm gonna be creating a sample of the slotted seam, but you're gonna put this slotted seam anywhere you put a normal seam. You're just gonna follow these steps. So we're gonna pretend that this is any seam that you're working on. So we've got 2 pieces of fabric to seam together, and then we need a narrow piece of ribbon, or you can also cut a piece of fabric and finish the edges. I like to use something that's about 1 inch wide. The first step is placing your fabric right sides together and sewing a seam with a basting stitch. My seam allowance for this is going to be 1/2 inch. I'm going to use a basting stitch from end to end. We're going to be using a basting stitch because later we're going to remove it. A basting stitch is a temporary stitch that we're going to remove later. Because of that long stitch length, it makes it easier to remove. To create the basting stitch, all you need to do is put on your straight stitch and make the stitch length as long as it'll go. On my machine, it goes to 5. Now I'm adding my temporary stitch. Now that we have our 1/2 inch seam complete, we're going to iron it open. And we're done ironing it open. Now that we have our seam ironed open, let's go over the next step. Now you want to take the right side of your ribbon or the right side of your fabric and you're going to place it face down on top of the seam. So the wrong side of the ribbon or fabric should be facing you. And we want that to be perfectly lined up here with our seam. And while we're here with the ribbon, let's talk about what you do if your ribbon is way wider than your seam, because you know you're gonna fall in love with a ribbon that's way too wide. Well, all you need to do is cut it down and finish the edge. You could serge it, zigzag it, overcast it, bias bind it. Just make sure you don't have a raw edge inside of your project. And when you cut it down, you wanna cut it down the width of your seam. Or you could just make a bigger seam and have a really big pop of ribbon or fabric popping through that seam. But you might need to add to your pattern because you need to follow the seam allowance on your pattern. So if you want to make 1 inch seam and your seam allowance is only 1/2 inch on your pattern, that means you need to add 1/2 inch to each side of your pattern before you cut it out. So now let's pin this up. I like to pin the ends before I flip it over and start pinning from the outside, just so it doesn't move on me, because the ribbon is totally gonna move around on you or your fabric piece. So 1 in the middle, 1 on each end. Now let's flip it over. And now we know that it's in the right position, so we can put some pins on the outside. Just make sure you're going through all of the layers. I usually pin it every 2 or 3 inches. I'm gonna put a pin by the one that's in the middle on the back side, and then I'm going to remove that one, because we don't want to have to try and flip over the fabric and remove it from the back side while we're sewing. We're pinning it from the right side of the fabric because we're going to be sewing on the right side next. Now we're going to add a top stitch to both sides of the seam. So we're going to be sewing 1/4 inch away from the seam down this side and down this side. And before we start sewing, we need to change our stitch length back to our regular stitch length for the project. This could differ depending on the fabric you're sewing on. If you're using a light cotton, it's probably about 2 or 2.5. Speaking of sewing, make sure you check out the Anastasia.com. We now offer online sewing classes. And we also have a Pattern of the Month club that you can join, where you get a new exclusive pattern every single month. And if you're enjoying this video, please like and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. I put my 1/4 inch foot on so that way I can get a nice perfect 1/4 inch stitch away from the seam, but you can use your regular foot as well. Don't forget the back stitch in the beginning. Also, make sure you remove your pins before you get to them. Back stitch at the end and cut it. Now I'm going to turn my project around and sew 1/4 inch down the other side. And you get to the end, back stitch and cut. Now that you have both of your top stitches on top of the ribbon, it's holding down the ribbon, but our seam is sewn shut and we can't see that ribbon. So what we need to do is open it up with our seam ripper, and then we'll have a little peekaboo of pink ribbon. Now we put the basting stitch in here so that way it was easy to remove. I'm going to be using my seam ripper to open up the seam, and do it nice and slow so you don't destroy your fabric. And now you can go back and just pick out those little threads there. A little trick is take an eraser and you can rub it along it. It'll help pick them off, or you can also get a lint roller. Now that all the threads are off, our seam is finished. Let's check it out. So you can see that the seam opens up now, and we've got a little pop of ribbon in there. So a little extra fun, and you can choose to use a contrasting thread or a matching thread depending on the look you're going for. And this is really fun down seams because when you're wearing something and you're moving around, you just get that little extra pop of color there. So now you know how to create a slotted seam, and you can add them to your projects and give it a higher end look with some more detail. And I bet you've already created a slotted seam and you don't even know it. If you've put in a regular zipper, that is essentially a slotted seam. A regular centered zipper is hiding under the flaps of the seam. So instead of this being a piece of ribbon, it would be zipper teeth. Now it's time to take a look at your wardrobe and see if you have any slotted seams on your garments. If you do, leave it down below. I would love to know which garments have the slotted seam. And if you're going to be adding them to a project, what kind of projects are you going to be adding the slotted seam to? Is it going to be a dress, maybe down some princess lines? That could be pretty cool. Maybe on a pocket, adding some extra detail to it. Let me know down below in the comments. Thanks so much for watching today. If you have any questions on creating the slotted seam, leave that down below in the comments as well. And if you're not already a subscriber, make sure you subscribe to Anastasia, hit that notification bell, so that way you know when the new videos come out. I put out a few videos every single week. And if you don't follow me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all the social, make sure you add Sewing Anastasia so that way we can stay connected and creative together. And don't forget, you can take sewing classes in person with me in my studio in Chicago or online. Links for those are down below. Thanks so much for watching. Bye.